welcome to this Navigating Essential Change webinar. My name is Mark Jennings from NHS Improving Quality, and I'm pleased to be chairing this webinar today. I'm pleased to welcome you to it. The webinar is sponsored by Arden and Greater East Midlands CSU and by NHS Improving Quality. And this is the second in our series of Navigating Essential Change. Hopefully you'll all be able to log on successfully this morning. We'll start the webinar in a moment. If you want to ask a question during the webinar, you can either raise your hand, and you should see the raise your hand symbol on your panel on the right hand side of your screen. Alternatively, you can type a question into the question box, and we'll pick that up and answer that as we go. So either raise your hand or ask questions. We really encourage you to do that. If you get any technical problems, you can also send us questions in the chat box as well to the organiser, and we'll do our best to answer those. So if we can go on to the next slide. Really pleased to welcome you to this Navigating Essential Change webinar, and this is the second in our series, and today we've got Simon Angelides with us from Arden and Greater East Midlands CSU, and this is the second in the series. The first one focused really on setting the scene for service reconfiguration, about what service reconfiguration was about, the definitions and some of the key issues. And today we're really getting into the meat of this with how to establish a service reconfiguration program. And I'm going to just ask you online about your experiences of service reconfiguration before we start. So if you can see the poll panel on your right-hand side of your screen, it's going to say how many people are currently thinking about starting or engaged in a service reconfiguration. So you can just click yes or no. Not if you're an organiser or a panellist, but anybody else online, if you'd like to do that. We'll just have a look at the results of that. And you should be able to see the results are now coming in. Feel like election night here, because we've got 75% of people on the call, which I suppose is a self-selecting group of people because they're interested in service reconfiguration, but 3/4 of people suggesting they'll be involved in service reconfiguration. And that ties in with the results from the Health Service Journal. If we can go back to the slides and close the poll. The Health Service Journal survey suggested that most NHS CCGs are going to be involved in service reconfiguration. I think that potentially that's going to be more with the coming of the 5-year forward view. Maybe we'll talk a bit about that later on. I think we've got that stats on, and almost half of CCGs need to consider major service reconfiguration by this summer. And that may increase, as I say, with a 5-year forward view. So that really makes what Simon's going to talk about just really poignant this morning. So I think we'll get into the heart of this now and introduce Simon Angelides, as Director from the Arden and Greater East Midlands CSU. And Simon's he'll introduce himself, but take us through, in effect, the essence of establishing a service reconfiguration program, which he's got considerable experience of. So Simon, I'll hand the baton over to you. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mark. As Mark's outlined, the purpose of this webinar is to help commissioners and senior leaders within local health economies think about actually starting a reconfiguration program. It might be that the reconfiguration program is about transforming the way clinical services are delivered. It may not be that a reconfiguration is the route that you start out at the beginning, but it's about thinking about what the program design needs to look like, the key considerations that need to be as part of that, and the characteristics that need to support that, both in terms of if you're going as a formal reconfiguration or as something that might change over time into turning into a reconfiguration. It's also about trying to balance the competing requirements within the development of the program. there's often not a clear answer as to what you need to do or the way you need to do it, and it's about negotiating through a series of compromises to allow you to get to an equitable solution where everybody feels that we're going on the most appropriate course going forwards. And it's also to think about some of the early challenges that might be faced in the development of a programme, because often these define things that will happen much later on in the process. So without getting too much into those challenges, it's trying to think about how they might be mitigated at this stage, or what thinking you need to do about those as you go and take it forwards. Again, the ideas here are that we can go and apply this to any type, shape or clinical focus for a reconfiguration, and specifically thinking how it might support the new models of care that NHS England are asking commissioners to consider. Again, as with the first webinar, this supports the recent NHS guidance on planning and delivering service changes for patients. For me, this is quite a key document, as this sets out the legal and policy framework in which these service changes need to be delivered. So in starting out, what are the key areas that we need to consider when establishing a programme, and are there some good design principles from my experience that can inform this design? So there are 4 areas that I think, when you're thinking about service reconfiguration, that need to consider this design process. I think the first one is around interest. A lot of service reconfiguration changes to the delivery of services are going to attract a significant amount of public and media interest. I think this is often underestimated when things first kick off, and we find that a lot of the senior leaders within the health economy get sucked into this. I think the other thing to say about this is it often has an impact on relationships in terms of where the health system isn't acting with a single voice and where there are differing narratives. Sometimes this can play into the relationships that already exist, both in terms of good and bad, but also the other relationships and issues that you've got outside of the programme can be brought in, and the interest from the public can heighten these differences. I think the second thing to think about is around scrutiny. The Local Health and Overview Scrutiny Committee is there to hold the local NHS bodies to account. So when you're thinking about designing a programme, my feeling is that you really ought to be having early conversations with the chair, with the committee, both in a formal and informal setting, to go and think about how that design should be taken forward, how they feel that ought to be impacted, the ways in which you can go and gain local engagement, and I'm sure they'll provide really excellent advice on doing this. I personally found that was really helpful. I think the third area is around perceptions. There's likely to be a difference between different organisations and even within organisations as to what the cause of the problems are and the potential solutions. Again, it's important that you have an open mind when you're thinking about the changes that you want to go and make, and that the first stages really need to be around developing a narrative as to what the cause is. But it's important that you flush out at a really early stage where the differences of perception are, and therefore establish a set of principles by which you can move forwards, rather than trying to develop a single view at this point in the process. I think the final area is around planning. You need to be quite clear, even at this stage, about what deliverables that you need. Whilst we can't be clear about, the overall clinical model that's going to be required, I think there is a need to be clear about what the outputs are and how the evidence base will be developed through the programme as you move forwards. Too often there's a hiatus between different stages in terms of we've gone through this stage and then there's a pause and then we go through a second stage. Again, it should be an iterative process, but also one that builds on evidence that you're developing during the course of the programme, rather than looking at it as individual blocks. So how are these competing needs going to translate into the operation of the programme? Initially at the start there will be a need to balance two different demands. The first is around progressing the programme in terms of getting the infrastructure and governance set up, but also making sure that you've got good external engagement. They are quite conflicting in terms of where the focus needs to be, but the duality of them means that you need to do them both at the same time. You will also need to make rapid progress across a number of work streams, which often have complex linkages across different domains. This means that there's issues that will emerge that you won't have thought about right at the beginning. So developing a level of flexibility into the thinking and making sure that you can rapidly move between the different work streams and understand those linkages is really important. Overseeing this process, you need to make sure you've got a really good, robust decision-making process, which I feel needs a high degree of self-reflection in that the decisions that you make might not always be the right ones, and that you need potentially to go back and reassess them later down in the process. It's not always clear that you've made the right choice, and as I said before, there might not be a right choice. There might be two choices and one might just be less bad than the other one. And I think the final thing that needs to translate into the operation of the programme is that you need to create and maintain confidence in the process. Too often that confidence is lost through the process. Differing bodies have different views, but it's about trying to make sure that you've got at a system level, you bring everybody with you. And that's, for me, probably the overriding thing in terms of these competing needs. If you don't have the confidence of the local health system and the bodies that are supporting it, then it's very difficult to go and deliver this change. So if I was going to go and pick out some principles of how this might inform the design of the programme, it's really important there's strong leadership, but which is seen to be organisationally agnostic. You don't want us seen to be having a leadership within these sorts of programs which is very much focused on the outcomes of particular organisations as being the key way forward or for the key benefit. I think the other thing that needs to inform the design is it often takes longer and requires more resources than originally scoped. We are very prone within the NHS of making quite aggressive targets with often too few resources. The issue is that as progress is made through the development of the process, increasingly resources need to be pumped into the process to go and stabilise the requirements and the deliverables that need to be met, rather than having a more balanced resourcing view over the entirety of the programme. You need to also think about the use of independent bodies, organisations and individuals that can go and increase trust in the process. There is cynicism and a lack of trust out there, but by providing within the governance framework a level of independence and a level of scrutiny within the programme, as well as through external organisations like HOSC, then I think that would set down a marker to the local community that you are taking their concerns and their interests very, very seriously, and therefore trying to hold yourself to account in ways that you don't necessarily need to do, and you're going above and beyond that. Crucially, within reconfigurations, there needs to be a clear line of sight to the decisions made to the CCG membership. Whilst a lot of the technicalities of what needs to be done and the development needs to be done within the programme, ultimately CCGs are a membership organisation, and therefore at some point it may be required for the membership to vote on proposals that are being taken forward as a membership organisation as a whole, not just as the CCG board. Sometimes it's very easy to forget that in terms of trying to make sure we're running at pace and meeting public expectations, but again, that line of sight to the membership is something that needs to be thought about, considered and reflected on throughout the process. There's going to be a number of sub-projects that will have a strong influence on the programme. Things like transport always come up as being a really key issue for the public, but not one which is central to the NHS. However, this can have a really, really significant impact on the way the programme's perceived and the seriousness that the NHS is taking of public opinion. Other things like inequality also need to be programmed in very early on, because not only do they have an impact on the legal duties of the CCG, but they can also have a profound effect upon the clinical model. My final principle is that the leadership team needs to have a strong sense of not only the what, but also the how in terms of the programs that they need to go and develop. Often you have great principles with local leadership in terms of what they want to do to go and translate their vision into the local community, but it's the development of the how which is often where the NHS gets unstuck. So during the initial phase of the programme, I've got this little diagram which looks at the way in which two differing paradigms would affect each other. So on the one hand, you've got from top to bottom, you've got alignment versus detail. It's very easy to get alignment between different stakeholders, organisations, individuals, if you're not very clear on the detail, because it gives a level of interpretation to those that are participating in it to interpret it in a way which is appropriate to them. The issue is that as you go through the process, you will need to get more and more detailed, and that means that alignment becomes more difficult to achieve. The second axis is around engagement versus pace. Again, this is a balance that needs to be had between making sure that you've got really robust engagement, you've got everybody participating. That's difficult to achieve if you're trying to move at pace. Again, as you move through the programme, the level of engagement may flex backwards and forwards, but at some point a series of decisions are going to need to be made, and so therefore, whilst you will need to maintain engagement, you will need to move ultimately to the top left-hand corner, recognising that you need to keep a minimum level of engagement across all the stakeholders with the public around what you're doing. So again, these are competing demands, and sometimes it's necessary to go to the bottom right-hand corner if you can't get the support that you need. So trying to think through some of the practical implications for designing a reconfiguration programme, I think the first area that I want to concentrate on is, do you have the right resources? Are they the right shape? These are my views in terms of designing, having thought about designing and designing my own programs to go and deliver reconfigurations. My view is that you need to have a small core team that really understands what you're trying to deliver, and that is very flexible in terms of what they can go and achieve within that small core team. It needs to be integrated, and it needs to be the key driver responsible for moving the program forward. It also needs to have the capability and capacity to manage and engage the third parties. So it's very flexible in terms of having an understanding of the how, and therefore can pull in the right components to go and deliver that. My feeling, an example would be you might want to outsource the PMO or your integrated impact assessment. So therefore, this core team needs to be able to commission and manage and engage those third parties in terms of a way of getting best practice, identifying the right suppliers, manage them on an ongoing basis. There was also a need for clinical understanding, because not only that, but the way that interrelates to other factors such as comms, transport, workforce, because it's those interdependencies when you're developing the clinical models and the factors that transport or workforce might have in terms of not only coming up with a range of models that you're looking at, but also the ones that you're going to go for, I think is quite essential. Yes, you are going to need subject matter experts to come in and provide support to those, but it's really that core understanding that that team has that should be driving it forwards. So how do we make sure that the programme can deliver the case for change, your pre-consultation business case, and the public consultation? Well, I think planning and early planning is key to this approach in terms of being clear about the life cycle of the programme and how the deliverables will be built on each other. You need a clear expectation of what's needed at the end of the process, and especially how that support and development process will get you through those milestones and gateways and take you forwards. It's really important that the case for change is able to build towards the pre-consultation business case, and similarly the pre-consultation business case moves towards the public consultation and ultimately the decision by the CCGs. Being able to make those linkages is really essential, because it's the evidence base when you come to the public consultation which needs to be set out fundamentally in the case for change, and a line between those 2 points needs to be easily drawn. One of the key factors in delivering successful service change is being able to come up with this compelling narrative which makes the linkage between that case for change and why you need to go and consult the public on why you're making these changes. I think there's also something around having regular checkpoints to validate the shape of those final deliverables and make sure they're fit for purpose. Often the programme will go through various iterations, and therefore being clear about the processes that you need to go through, and again that self-awareness, that checking back is really important in terms of making sure that when you come to those big set pieces, such a case for change, pre-consultation business case, that they are fit for purpose. I think the final area that I think is really, really crucial is thinking about peer review. It's very easy within local health economies to provide assurance to yourself that you are doing the right thing and the things that you are doing are being taken forward appropriately. However, things like financial assurance are probably better done by an external party to the local health economy than by those partners within it. So what do you need to do to, what support is needed to achieve an aligned view in terms of the clinical model that you're going to be developing and the supporting options? The leadership team will need to make an early assessment of the opinions that are out there, as this will inform the development process. Whilst you need to enter this with an open mind, it's important that you understand the opinions out there, especially in terms of the concerns and the need for change within the system. There's a range of strategies that can be considered in terms of trying to get this aligned view, ranging from informal workshops through to the formal engagement of the Royal Colleges, and there's a number of strategies in between. But again, it will be dependent on the situation and the locality and the differing opinions within the different organisations, and also the different opinions within those organisations. What's really important is that people go through a process which is not seen to be top-down, but allows them to go through a developmental approach whereby everybody comes to an aligned view. Now, whilst you might not be able to get everybody there, it's really important that you identify the key staff that need to be on board with that process, and that you define a process that will allow them to not only have their voices heard, engage in the process, and support the decision-making processes that you're going through. Formal processes may not align to the clinical community. So again, what you need to think about is how you get those minority voices heard and engaged. It's very easy for a management team within a trust to define what they need to be doing to go and take the organisation forward and what they feel is in the best interests of their community, but there might well be some minority voices which, when you come to the end of the process, are sufficiently loud and important that they need to be heard, and by that stage it becomes more polarised and more difficult to go and take them forward. And the final thing to say on this is the greater alignment of clinical opinion that you have, the more likely you are to go and get public support. This has been very well documented in that if you have all of your clinicians from the local community stating that this is, in their opinion, what you need to be doing, the greater the chances are for you to go and get support. Now, whilst I've mentioned all of these things, I think one of the key areas that it becomes difficult is the complexity of what's going to be delivered. I've got a programme structure map which is from our Healthier South East London, which demonstrates the decision-making processes that everybody needs to go through in order to translate this into a workable structure in terms of the governance of the various stakeholders and committees and organisations that are involved. However, what you can translate this through to is a more generic element which is easier to understand and would be more digestible both to the local community but also to those working across the NHS. The key point here is that there are those parts of the process which are advisory, which is at the bottom half, and those parts that are decision-making in the top half. So the CCGs, NHS England in terms of specialised and primary care commissioning, and the trusts involved all have a mechanism in terms of decision-making, and they're going to be supported by NHS England, the NTDA, and Monitor. The CCGs can come together as a committee in common, if that's appropriate, with or without NHS England, and it will be these bodies that make the decisions ultimately. Below that is where the programme infrastructure sits. So you'll have a programme board that will be made up of the organisations above. You'll probably have some sort of executive team that's responsible for the operation of the programme, and then I would expect to see at least 3 subcommittees that are being used to go and develop and drive the programme forwards. One around finance, one around stakeholder, public and patient, and the third one around clinical, with specialty groups supporting that clinical subcommittee. Whilst I think the finance and the clinical subcommittees are well understood, I think it's just worth dwelling on the patient, public and stakeholders committee, in that there is an expectation within the NHS England guidance that this has real teeth in terms of being able to inform the decision-making process. I think if you can also demonstrate this when you're going out to public consultation, in that it has had a real impact in not only shaping the way the consultation will be taken forwards, but also the decisions that have got you to the point where you are, I think it's much more likely that the public will support the changes that are being made. So whilst we have some potentially very complex structures that are used to support reconfiguration, it can actually be distilled down to quite a small number of components that come together both as decision making and as advisory. So again, going back to resources, so what are needed to go and support the programme? I think there's 3 elements that need to be considered when you're thinking about the shape of the resource profile. The first is around a triangle of quality, cost and time. Any type of project that you're going to deliver needs to sit across these 3 areas, and the decision that you've got to make around which resourcing profile you're going to be using is based upon those 3 considerations. The second one is around stakeholder relationships. Again, the way in which you'll actually develop and undertake the decisions will be informed by the relationships that you've got between the stakeholders that are supporting that. The easier and more integrated those relationships are, the less pressure there is on the cost, quality and time, because you'll be able to make progress more easily and hopefully utilise resources from within the community, within the local health economy. Where those relationships are further apart, you're going to need to think about something which is a slightly more distant, but again the quality, cost and time will increase to be able to balance out the differences of the stakeholder view. I think the third element that needs to inform the resourcing profile is around your supply methodology. Quite often there's a perception that a generic change method should be used. My feeling is that it needs to be much more specific to service reconfiguration, and a more generic transformational model, whilst appropriate, will focus on some areas which are less important. It's important that you are clear about the process that you need to go through and the decision-making points that you are moving towards and the evidence that you're building up. That sometimes isn't supported by the transformational methodologies that are out there. So again, 3 areas that need to be considered.
Simon, can I just interrupt you a second there and just check, when you just for clarity, when you're talking about supplier methodology, is this supplier of change management support you're talking about? Not not the provider of health services.
No, it's the methodologies that a provider will bring in to support the change process. Unlike organisational transformation change, reconfiguration has a policy and a legal framework in which it's got to be delivered in. So a clear understanding of those 2 elements is really important. You need to have that underlying change methodology, and I think that's important, but there are some specific things around service reconfiguration that need to be developed and delivered, which is above and beyond what you see within those traditional transformational change methods.
Yeah, thank you. I thought I'd just clarify the terminology, because we are recording this webinar and people listening to it later may not get the chance to check their understanding. So thank you for that, Simon. I'll let you carry on.
That's great. Okay. So, we talked earlier about having a core team, and that maybe a good approach, in my opinion, is to use other resources flexibly to go and deliver some key areas within the programme where specialist knowledge is required, but you might not want to have them as being part of the core team. So some of these areas are integrated impact assessment, which would be seeking to address the issues around equality and inequality, looking at clinical stakeholder engagement and analysis, so being specifically drawing together the clinical community from across the local health system, engaging them and getting a clear view about how that's taken forward. Patient flows and projections. Again, this is really important in terms of what's going to happen within the local health system, but also being able to articulate that to the wider surrounding health systems, as it's likely to be those that are impacted by any changes, and so being able to articulate that clearly and succinctly in a way that will allow them to go and inform their engagement with the process is really important. Business case development, obviously you've got your pre-consultation business case, which needs to be able to not only jump through the various requirements of NHS England, but also needs to be one which is engaging with the public. Transportation analysis, we've talked about previously, public engagement materials and events, and also being able to bring forward your analysis of the public consultation itself. Financial input, again, it's likely that any service change will attract some sort of capital requirement to go and support that, and therefore whatever needs to be taken forwards in terms of that capital analysis needs to probably go not only to the CCGs but also within the trust and their decision making processes, and also the wider public engagement. So depending on the capabilities of your organisation, some of these all of these elements may be able to be produced internally. But again, it's good to have a strategy from the outset as to how you think you're going to need to develop this capability, because again, public procurement processes, if there aren't relationships that you have already that are able to address some of these things, then it might have an impact on the overall timeline. Again, my advice would be where these topics are considered to be contentious, it will be better that these are developed externally to be able, from a legal perspective, to be able to be clear that there's a level of independence between what's being asked for and the outputs that are being delivered. So the final area I just want to touch on quickly is around governance and transparency as a way of strengthening local engagement. So the NHS Constitution sets out how the programme should support good governance. I think that for me there's 4 areas that really stand out around this. So there's something around engagement, the quality of engagement, making sure the quiet voices are heard within the community, and making sure that you are seen to be being held to account by the local community, rather than having a very ivory towered approach. I think the more that you can get out into the and engage with the public, the stronger the narrative that you will have, and the greater engagement you will have from those that you're talking to. I think there's also something around making sure the actions are owned. Good record keeping is absolutely essential in terms of being able to go back to that evidence base that we talked about earlier, and also developing a strong PMO as well as a way of supporting that programme of change. I think it's also good to think about what advice you need. Compliance is really, really essential, and too often what we need to do is seem to be doing one thing, but sometimes it isn't followed through in the paperwork, and making sure that we've got that really robust audit trail. And you also need to come back and check back and do that often. I think the final thing is, especially as we have this evolving landscape with GP federations and CCGs and NHS England, is to be clear about people's interests. Again, making sure that you can support probity through the use of independent chairs is something which will play well and is a good thing to be doing within the local community. So again, a level of independence within the programme is also something that will support both good governance and engagement with the local population. So my final slide is thinking about transparency. So there needs to be a balance between too much information and not enough. Yes, most service reconfiguration programs will have a website, but it's about, it can be quite stale, quite dry, but it's about trying to engage with those key stakeholders from across the community and making sure you have a really good engagement with them, whereby you're able to engage with them on the information that's important to them and that they feel that they can go and contribute towards. So the timeliness and consistency of the information is going to be really important in terms of having a consistent engagement plan, both through your formal communications and the informal communications. I think it's another key factor is the need to be clear of the areas where inputs are required and the way in which stakeholders are expected to manage the information. Again, as we said, that public, patient and stakeholder subcommittee within the programme structure is, for me, quite an important driver in terms of being able to strengthen the transparency of the programme that's being taken forward, and therefore managing that information is quite key. And then the final thing is making sure that the right audiences have been engaged. There's often a perception that we've engaged with an audience and that particular group or stakeholder or organisation has had the information that they need, and whereas when you actually go back and talk to them, obviously sometimes it can come back with a different perception. So again, making sure the right audiences have been engaged in a continuous way is something which needs to be an ongoing focus of the programme. So Mark, hopefully that's given you a canter over the various areas that I think are important when thinking about designing the programme. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was an excellent, comprehensive run-through. I'm sure everybody on the line will be taken value from that. I'm happy to take questions. If you want to raise your hand by clicking the icon next to your name on the attendees box on the go-to screen, or type into the question box or type into the chat box. Whilst you're all thinking about that, I'll throw in a couple of questions that I've got myself, Simon. And you mentioned yourself the new service models as part of the 5-year forward view, Simon Stevens' paper on the 5-year view forward on the NHS. Surely, are those going to require this same level of public consultation? And they sound to be, they're quite new ideas. Are we still going to need to consult, and or have we got any dispensation to be able to move forward with those? What's your feeling?
I think it depends on the changes that are going to be proposed out of them. If you're moving to a series of models of care, then for some health systems the change will not necessarily be that radical. But for others, I think there might be some more significant changes in the way that services are delivered to the public. Where those changes are more radical, the guidance is very clear, both in terms of around service change, but also the wider guidance on public consultation as well. So I think it will depend on the starting point that you start from as to whether or not it's going to attract a reconfiguration program. It might be that you start with the point of having not going down a service reconfiguration, but you might find that as the process develops and as you go through, the changes become more significant, and that through the option development process you actually find that you are doing a service reconfiguration. So I think whilst we talk about the process that we go through in terms of something that's very specific to doing a particular thing with services, I think there are some principles around that that can be applied to any transformational program.
Yeah, no, thank you. It occurred to me that when you mentioned having good evidence for your case for change, that in effect some of these new models for the NHS are in effect a leap of faith, because we don't necessarily know that they'll work. We haven't done some of them before. Multi-specialty community providers being one, breaking the acute primary divide that we've had for more than 60 years in the NHS. But no, I think that's a good point you've made there, that some of these things are organisational changes that might ultimately lead to service changes which will need consultation. I'd encourage anybody on the line to ask a question, or raise your hand if you want to, and we'll bring you in. You can ask that question, or if you're a bit shy about asking the question online, you can type your question into the chat box. I've got another question here that's come in. You mentioned, Simon, leaders being agnostic. How do leaders actually do this? Because all leaders are employed by an organisation. They're part of the CCG, or they're part of the acute provider, or they're part of NHS England. How does a leader become agnostic?
Well, it's a relative scale. I think the issue is that a service change will mean a change of resources from the current provision. So that means that an organisation might be doing one thing before the reorganisation and another thing afterwards. I think what you need to be having is a position which is around what is the best thing for the patient, and can we base that on evidence, which is where your previous point becomes slightly more difficult to demonstrate, in terms of we need to think through the evidence base by which we're making those decisions and be clear on the evidence. Sometimes the evidence isn't quite there, and you need to go through a series of compromises. But it's about going through those series of compromises and taking that forwards, and looking at it from an evidential base that is really important.
Thank you. And I've just got another question here that's been raised about independent chairs. You were stressing towards the end of your presentation the value of independent chairs. How do you go about having an independent chair? Is that recruited from the local community? I mean, it sounds like you've got experience with this, Simon. I just wonder if you could share your experience of the value and how you go about that.
Yeah, so I always think that Healthwatch is a good place to start. They will, whilst they are wanting to be apart from the programme and won't necessarily want to scrutinise what's happening, they'll be a good place to go and identify people that have the right skills and experience to go and support the changes that you're looking to go and implement. They'll know people that have their own networks, and therefore will be able to take a wider set of soundings as to what needs to be done and scrutinise where you are and what you're doing. So I think Healthwatch would be my starting point for doing that. I think what's the two key things there is going back to confidence from the local community that those chairs are capable of scrutinising the decisions, and they are not just seen as part of the NHS infrastructure, and also that they have got good governance skills, in that they are going to be needing to do something within a formal setting, and so therefore I think those two factors need to be balanced.
Okay, thank you very much. And I've got to see a hand raised from Tom Skinner on the line. If we could unmute Tom and bring in Tom, do you want to ask your question? Tom, are you there?
Hi, Mark. Thank you. It was just hi, can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can hear you.
Hello.
Go ahead. We can hear you, Tom. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks. Firstly, great. First, I've enjoyed it so far. It's just a quick question about when working in a large, complex program. How am I able to keep the need for change simple?
okay. That's a very good question. I think you've got to go back to the clinical evidence. You're going to have a range of documents, when you're setting out the strategic context of why you're doing what you're doing. You'll be drawing on a number of different sources and a number of different evidence bases to be able to go and do that. So that needs to be both robust in terms of the evidence that you're pulling out, recognised across the local health system in terms of the data source, the information being provided. But then it's about trying to distill that down into bite-sized chunks that you can go and engage the local population on, and in the process of distilling that down, I think this is again where we need to bring the public more into the decision-making process, which is engaging the public in terms of how that process of thinking about the evidence is distilled down, how you create a message which resonates within the local community, and also, having got that resonance, how is it expressed in a way that the layperson can go and understand. And also I think there's a bit here about being clear about the reasons for change. So if you look at, we did a blog post recently on the case for change. A significant number of reconfigurations are driven by either workforce or finance concerns. Yet if you look at the majority of the cases for change, the vast majority of them don't talk about these things. So I think it's also needs to be about not ducking those key questions about why you're doing what you're doing, because otherwise it's just not seen as being credible by the local population. And then you've got to stick to that narrative through the programme. There's no point in having, well, we're doing this, we're doing that, because people will remember what you said. So it's quite important you get that case for change established, and you've got that clear narrative, and then that it drives through the process that you're going to take it forward, without looking at individual programs about, but I would also say it's quite tricky. It's not something which is particularly easy, and these programs take a long time, and they are complex for a reason. So there's a real skill in trying to make sure that your comms and engagement team are able to express it, and then that's supported by the senior leaders around the system in terms of having a really compelling narrative which is digestible. So,
thank you, Simon, and thank you, Tom. I think that was a great question. I mean,
thanks a lot for that.
Leadership is about simplifying complexity, and I think that's what Simon said here. People on the line might be interested to know, I know Charlie Keeney from the NHS IQ was on the line, but I think he's now gone off the call. There is a programme that NHS IQ runs that helps people create a compelling narrative for change. Simon mentioned using a methodology to help people craft that message in a way that really helps engage people and motivate them towards supporting the change. I'll give one last chance for anybody else on the line to ask a question by raising a hand or putting their message in the chat box or the question box. I don't think I have any more at the moment. I've got one more question for you, Simon. You mentioned, and you actually highlighted the need to keep a line of sight to the membership of CCGs. I was just wondering if you think is that a particular risk you think in the current system as we've bed down to having membership organisations as commissioners? And it sounds like you might have some experience of it as well.
Well, I'm just reflecting on what happened in South West London, where the proposals for the service reconfiguration were taken to the CCG membership, and it was the membership that declined to support it. And then that had a significant impact on the development of the programme. You are required by NHS England to be able to demonstrate that's membership support, so it's not just the governing body, it's the membership. Doesn't mean to say you need to necessarily have a formal vote, but you need to be quite clear that there is support from the membership. And if you get to the point where the membership is going to be voting on it, then unless you have that support and unless you'll be able to demonstrate you've got that support, it becomes quite difficult for the governing body to go and take those processes forward. I don't think we've had too much in terms of being able to this being a particular issue, but it is one of those things that can sort of creep up on you, whereby you've got the executives all agreed on what you need to be doing, but again, the CCGs are membership organisations. They are made up of primary care clinicians, and they are influenced by their local population. So again, you wouldn't want to get to the point where, having been out to public consultation, you take it back for a decision and it is either pre or post public consultation that your CCG membership is not inclined to support the proposal. So it is a risk, about a small one, but it is one which could have a really profound impact on what you need to do and how far back in the process you need to go.
In my mind, it reinforces what you were saying earlier, which is about the preparation that needs to be done in terms of consultation and alignment before you're consulting. with clinicians. That's excellent. Thank you very much. We're coming up to 11 o'clock, so I think we'll conclude now. Thank you very much, Simon. Excellent presentation. We'd appreciate your feedback. There's a link online there. And just a reminder that the next in the series is on Wednesday the 4th of February at 10 a.m. And Simon, do you want to just share with us what you'll be talking about in the final one of the series?
Again, we're going to be looking at governance in terms of how do you think about the decision-making processes, how are they going to be supported. Again, it's trying to go into a bit more detail in terms of the thinking behind how you make sure those decisions are robust. It's around the governance, not the legal aspect of it, so I just want to make that clear. So it's about making sure that your program infrastructure is being governed in the right way to go and support the decisions that you need. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And if anybody wants further information or needs help, on the screen is the contact us at ardencsu.nhs.uk, and you can also get information on NHS improving quality from their website, NHS IQ. So thank you to Simon, thank you to all of you who joined the webinar this morning, and those of you listening to this as a recording have also found it useful. So thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.